Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to our very final live stream of 2021. We so appreciate all of your ongoing support and taking this long journey with us through these challenging times. It makes such a difference to have you with us as we negotiate back to our in-person events in early 2022. Please stay tuned to the end of this broadcast and I'll give you a brief heads up on what you can plan for in January and February. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica Duganzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur, our own politics professor, who will be leading politics in the time of coronavirus for the last time in 2021, but more exciting things to come in 2022. Hey, Dan.
Kim, happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you. This year has just flown by.
It has been quite a year. I can't believe it's been, 20 months since we started doing these programs?
Absolutely. And
that was back when there was an alpha variant, and now look at us.
We're going to go through the whole alphabet. Anyway, you've got a phenomenal couple of topics for us to dive into. So I want to get to that without any further ado, because everybody wants to hear from you on these key topics. Number one, getting ready for 2022, what to expect in the new year. And then secondly, red versus blue. Why are we so polarized and what can we do about it? So Dan, help us figure this all out. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Kim. And thanks to all of you, as always, for joining us for these programs. Like Kim said, I can't believe it. We're at the end of another year of our weekly gatherings. And as always, we're all very grateful to all of you for being willing to join us for these conversations. I was talking with Kim and Jessica and the rest of the team right before we came on to join all of you. And we were remarking that if, today's first topic, of course, is looking ahead at 2022. If at the end of last December, we had done a looking ahead at 2021, I don't think anybody would have predicted riots in the US Capitol on January 6th. We wouldn't have predicted, as Kim was mentioning, a Delta or Omicron variant. We wouldn't have predicted Afghanistan, so many things that have happened over the last 11 and a half months that we couldn't have predicted. So just for point of clarification, this program isn't going to be about predicting 2022, but as usual, just giving you some sense of the issues and the topics and the stories that we think are most important and most interesting and most impactful that we in the country and the world will be facing and navigating going forward. So in the first portion of the program, we have a lot to cover because there's lots ahead of us on this road through 2022. More COVID, of course, the continuation of President Biden's negotiations with Congress over his Build Back Better legislation or whatever its successor turns out to be, the midterm elections in November, of course, international matters in China, Russia, and Iran and elsewhere, climate change, immigration, crime, inflation, all sorts of topics to cover. And we'll get through as many of those as we can today. And then as I think all of you know, come January, we'll begin talking about each of these topics in more depth and more detail with our usual format. But today we're going to take a couple liberties with the format, not just trying to cover a lot of different issues in that first topic, but I've reached out for a little bit of help today. For those of you who watch this program regularly, you've always noticed in the past when I have a different backdrop behind me, and that's because instead of being in our study in Cecile and Maya's house in Los Angeles, instead, when you see this backdrop, it's because I'm visiting family in Wisconsin. And for at least a few minutes of today's program, I'm very, very happy to be joined by the person I think is our very smartest family member, This is my nephew, Matthew. And Matthew is 16 years old, which means, for those of you who do the math, means he'll be elected president of the United States in the year 2040 and take office in 2041. Matthew, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Matthew's going to help us get this conversation started. As those of you who have tuned in regularly, you've heard me say many times over the last year and a half, I like to quote Mark Twain. And Twain, of course, famously once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And Matthew is a real student of history. And one of the things that he and I have talked about since we've been here visiting is lessons from history that might be able to help us through this current, very turbulent time period. And I know, Matthew, one of the things you've read about and learned about and spent a lot of time thinking about is previous examples in history of societies who have to face the kind of polarization and strengthening of factions that we're seeing in our country and elsewhere in the world today. I'm wondering if you might be able to share with our audience a historical antecedent to help us get a better understanding of our current predicament.
Yes. So one example of that in history would be the transition from of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, and a large cause of that, not the only cause, but a large cause had to do with this rise in factions and increasing polarization. And while this republic imperfect, but had been around for almost 500 years, towards the end of it, these factions really grew and became very strong, and eventually tore the republic apart in a series of civil wars that eventually had the republic end up in an empire. And while we're not there yet, there are some parallels.
So neither of us, of course, Matthew, wants to be alarmist, but we have talked a lot in this webinar over the last couple of years, as many of you know, about this factionalization in this balkanization. And even though we're a long way from the kind of dire outcomes that Matthew has pointed us to in history, it is something that's important to keep in mind about what happens when we can't bridge these divisions. But Matthew, maybe I can ask you for another example from more recent history about how in the 20th century, our society and others managed to bridge these very divisive and very difficult tendencies.
Yes, so an example of that would be Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent movement, and how they really did change the world through this nonviolence. And well, right now we're seeing some backsliding with that in recent months, this past year. It's something we should look to help us move along.
Once again, a potential reminder that while we may have backslid, as you said, there really are examples from our not too distant past that we can overcome these divisions if we really set our mind to it.
Definitely.
Matthew, thanks so much for being with us. I really appreciate it, and I know our audience does too. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And make sure to save me a couple pieces of pizza, okay?
I'll do that.
All right, I'll see you guys in a little while. All right, so everybody, that is my brilliant nephew, Matthew Schnur, and I think he'd agree that he probably gave us a couple of helpful historical perspectives to move forward in the conversation. But what I want to do now going forward is go back to our usual format and talk about some of the things that we are going to see in the year ahead, some of the things that have caused the types of divisions and the type of polarization that Matthew is talking about. So topic A today, of course, is the renewed COVID threat, the Omicron variant. And as many of you know, I don't know if you watched it or not, but President Biden addressed the nation today to talk to us about how we should prepare for this next variant and what it means to all of us. And for me, the most interesting thing about the president's speech is not what he said, but rather when he said it. Joe Biden gave this speech at 2:30 in the afternoon, Eastern time, 11:30 on the Pacific coast. And generally speaking, when a president of the United States addresses the nation on a subject of seminal import, he'll address the nation in a prime time address at 8 or 9 p.m. East Coast time because he wants the largest possible audience to see it. And while I certainly don't think the White House was trying to hide the president, he had some important things to say about testing, about additional medical personnel being deployed to hospitals, additional vaccine availability, and so on. My own impression is that by scheduling this as a midday speech, rather than as a traditional prime time address to the nation, that this was not the White House trying to hide the president, but this was almost their way of tacitly acknowledging that there wasn't really a whole lot in addition he was going to be able to tell us beyond what he's told us in the past. It's also worth noting that despite what we're seeing in some of the nation's larger cities, the president did not talk at all about another shutdown of the type that we saw last year. But an important speech on an important topic, curiously positioned not to get the kind of attention that might have under more conventional circumstances. So Claire, if we can, let's go back to our group. And I'm going to ask everybody I'm out of order, and I apologize for that. We're going to go into a number of stories a little bit later. We started with COVID, obviously, but we want to know, can you put that one back up, Claire? My mistake. Oh, here we go. We're back to the first one. Okay, great. So my mistake, total apology. Claire was doing this the way we'd planned it, and I messed up. So COVID is one story, of course, and you'll see that as one of our alternatives here. But what do you think will be the most important news story of 2022? Do you think it's going to be the continuing fight in Washington over social spending and climate change? Do you think it'll be the midterm elections, the run-up to them and the election results themselves? Do you think, as we've begun talking about, it'll be the continuing threat of COVID? Fourth, do you think it'll be international affairs? Well, the stories and the challenges we face with Russia and China, Iran, and elsewhere, will that be the dominant story of next year? Or will it be something else? So again, forgive me for my error on that, but now that we've fixed it, let's hear from all of you and what you think the biggest story of the year will be. Well, very interesting. Look at that. 52%, more than half of our group thinks that the most important news story of next year is the midterm elections and what that means, the fight for control of Congress and potentially the groundwork being laid for the next presidential election. 21%, a little bit less than a quarter, said COVID. And less than that said the continuing fight in Washington over the president's legislative priorities in international affairs. So we're going to go back to COVID for a little bit. And I've talked to you about the president's speech. But going forward, while I don't like to make predictions, I have read a few predictions that I think, unfortunately, are going to be somewhat accurate as we continue to face this COVID challenge in the months ahead. We've now had 800,000 deaths in this country over the course of this pandemic, which means that sometime this spring, sadly, we're going to suffer our 1 millionth loss. Accompanying that is a prediction that our vaccination cards, which now for most of us have both our first 2 vaccinations and now our booster shot, that by sometime this year we'll have a full vaccination card as additional boosters and vaccinations become necessary. And as Kim mentioned before she stepped away a few minutes ago, it's entirely possible that maybe not in 2022, but as we continue to move forward and this pandemic becomes a more predictable part of our lives, we might end up, in fact, seeing an Omega variant as we move all the way through the Greek alphabet. So with that, Claire, let's get back on track and let's go back to our second question, one specifically about COVID, if we can. How concerned are you about the renewed COVID threat? The options are similar to when we asked this question earlier this fall, before we had a really good sense of Omicron. The options are very concerned, somewhat concerned, third slightly concerned, and fourth not concerned at all. And let's see how these results compare to what we saw earlier this fall, back when Delta, not Omicron, was our biggest concern. Well, look at those numbers. Very interesting and significantly greater levels of concern among our group now than even just a month ago when we last asked you about this. 49%, roughly half, are very concerned about COVID at this point. 89% are either very or somewhat concerned. And only 11% say slightly concerned, and 1% out there's someone who's not concerned at all. But these numbers are markedly higher than they were even a few weeks ago. And that's worth noting, although it's not particularly surprising. Let's keep going with questions, Claire. Let's see what the group has to say on our next our next COVID question. So the president talked today, as I mentioned a moment ago, about how he intends to respond to the expanded Omicron threat. Again, he talked about testing and vaccinations. He talked about additional medical personnel being deployed. He very specifically did not talk about another shutdown, although we've heard those voices beginning to emerge in different parts of the country. But what about you? What do you think? How should we be responding to the expanded Omicron threat? Should we be talking more seriously about economic and school shutdowns? Should we be mandating vaccines now as opposed to encouraging them, not just for government workers and healthcare workers, but for everyone? Should we be advocating and pushing for increased testing and making increased testing more available, as the president talked about today? Or should we be continuing our current policies? You know, we do have vaccines available to us. We do have additional testing capacity. And there's a lot of people who say that while, of course, Omicron is much more contagious, that it's not nearly as harmful. And that particularly for those who are vaccinated, that we'll be able to make it through without too much problem. So how should we be responding? Should it be renewed shutdowns? Only 1%, look at that. Only 1% believe that we ought to be shutting down again the way we did last year. But just as interesting, 61%, almost 2/3 of our group, believe we ought to be mandating vaccines for all Americans, not just for healthcare workers and government workers, and then smaller percentages for the other options. The biggest challenge, I think, though, for President Biden on this issue, and this has had a tremendously negative impact on his poll numbers, the biggest challenge for Biden, and I think this may be one of the reasons that the White House scheduled the speech for midday today rather than evening, his biggest challenge may be to just our exhaustion, and that we, the American people, are tired of COVID. Unfortunately, COVID isn't tired of us yet, as we've been reminded of very starkly just in the last several days. But Biden is walking a very difficult line between trying to encourage us forward, but also recognizing how badly most of us want this to be over. What was noticeable also in the president's language and his tone today is the way he talked about COVID. Back over the summer, if you remember, he talked about defeating the disease, about vanquishing coronavirus. The message we got from him today, perhaps not quite in these words, is that we're not going to defeat it. We're not going to eradicate it, but rather we're going to make the necessary adjustments to coexist with it. And Anthony Fauci was quoted today as saying, we've only eradicated one virus in world history, and that was smallpox. And his suggestion is just as how we've learned to live with flu and so many other diseases, that instead of vanquishing and defeating COVID, the question is how we're going to learn to live with it. And that is a difficult message for any leader to deliver. And so I suspect that President Biden's somewhat lower profile today may have had to do with the difficulty of delivering a message like that one. He certainly doesn't want anyone to panic because of this new variant. He also doesn't want to give us false hope. So the tone today was one of reassurance. And I suspect that that's one we're going to hear from the president and other national leaders going forward, is one of reassurance, of patience, of forbearance, of knowing that it is going to be some time before we get through this. And then perhaps it might not ever go away completely. Bigger news today, in the long run for us, even more than the president's speech perhaps, was it was announced that the USDA is now poised to approve pills, medicines to treat COVID once it's been contracted. So if we are going to have to learn to live with this disease as a pandemic turns into an endemic, not just having testing and vaccines, but medicine that can confront the symptoms we face, maybe that will make things a little bit easier for us to deal with. So much else ahead of us in 2020, in 2022. And you guys didn't give it a particularly high priority, but I do want to talk for just a moment about the Biden legislative agenda, because I suspect one of the reasons so few of you said it would be a big story in 2022 is because at the very end of 2021, just the day before yesterday, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who we've been talking about for many, many months, announced that he could not support the president's Build Back Better package. Now, I'll offer you my thoughts on this because I don't think that Manchin's announcement was nearly as seminal, frankly, not nearly as important as the news media and the White House and many of Manchin's fellow Democrats in Congress have made it out to be. My own opinion is that by saying I can't vote for this, Manchin didn't really change anything, because he said on Sunday, he said, I can't vote for this. Well, on Saturday, he wasn't voting for it. On Friday, he wasn't voting for it. For the last several months, he's been negotiating with the White House and with other congressional Democrats because he can't vote for the package as it currently stands. So I think by saying I can't vote for this, he's not saying he'll never vote for anything. Essentially, what he's trying to do is to reframe the debate in a way that's somewhat more favorable to him. And as many of you probably already read, Senator Manchin and President Biden were already on the phone Sunday night talking about potential next steps forward. So did the White House overreact to Manchin's announcement? Maybe. Or did they maybe pretend to overreact as a way of reassuring progressive Democrats that they weren't just going to roll over for Manchin again? But regardless, I don't think the negotiations are in a much different place today than they were last week. We knew in the middle of last week that nothing was going to get done this year, and that it was probably going to be January before any significant progress happened. We know that Manchin still prefers a package of roughly $1.5 trillion as opposed to $1.75 trillion. We know that Manchin made a proposal to Biden last week that included family leave, that included pre-kindergarten universal school for children, that included expanded health care. It included additional money, significant additional money for climate change. It did not include an extension of the children's tax credit, but otherwise Manchin seemed to be willing to move fairly far in the president's direction. So will this happen in the first week or two of January? Certainly not. This is going to go on for a while. But I don't think we as observers and as citizens should overreact to what Manchin said, because my belief, my guess is that these negotiations are going to pick up early next year and ultimately end up in a not very different place than they would have if Biden and Manchin had been able to finish for the end of 2021. So that's still an issue going forward. Before we move on from this topic, though, to our next one, I want to ask all of you, given the scope of the president's legislative goals in his Build Back Better reconciliation package, there's a lot there. And one thing we do know, given Manchin's announcement, is the bill is going to be narrower and it's going to be smaller. And we're already hearing from centrist Democrats in both the House and the Senate that rather than trying to accomplish a large number of policy goals for a relatively short period of time, they've begun encouraging President Biden and the White House to pick out their top policy priorities, and rather than trying to get all of them done, to work on just a smaller number. So here are what you see in front of you is 5 of the major features of the president's legislative package. If this is going to get winnowed, and only a couple of these are going to move forward in 2022 rather than all 5, which do you think are the most important? Are they climate change? Is it family leave? Is it universal pre-kindergarten? Would it be the children's tax credit? Or is it expanded access to Obamacare and other healthcare services? If you had to pick just one thing for the president and Congress to move forward with next year, which of these 5 would it be? Very interesting. More than half of you want to see the president and Congress prioritize climate change. And it is worth remembering, if we can leave that up for a minute, Claire, is that while Manchin is not nearly as aggressive on climate-related issues as most Democrats are, the proposal he made to Biden last week did include a very large amount of money out of that $1.7 trillion package for climate change. The access to Obamacare, pre-K, come in next. Those were in the package too. The children's tax credit was the only one of these 5 that wasn't in the Manchin counter proposal. So I think it's entirely possible that next year we'll see at least some of these, if not all of them, be signed into law once the president and Senator Manchin do come into agreement together. So many other things to talk about, and we're almost at the bottom of the hour, and I want to bring Jessica on to get to your questions. So I think what we'll do is, because all of you prioritize the midterm elections to such a degree, is we'll talk about that for a few minutes, and then the other topics that are likely to dominate news next year: international affairs, Russia, China, Iran, immigration policy, climate change policy, what Donald Trump will do next year. We're going to have to cover those in our regular webinar in 2022. But let's spend just a few minutes talking about the midterms before we bring the rest of you on for as many of your questions as we can get to. So the midterm elections, as we've talked about before, historical trends make the case very clearly that the president's party almost always loses seats in that president's first midterm elections. And you can go all the way back to the first decade of the 20th century and only find 3 midterm elections in all that time when the president's party gained seats rather than losing them. Now, Biden and his top lieutenants do believe that his party can maintain control of Congress. And what I'll say is that while the odds are against them, the path to doing that is a fairly clear one. Generally speaking, the voter turnout in midterm elections tend to be much lower than in presidential elections. And that occasional voters, younger people, voters from minority communities, tend to be less regular voters. And so what happens is, for in particular Democrats, especially when their party holds the White House, their base tends to be less enthusiastic and doesn't turn out in such high numbers. So if Biden is to succeed in the midterms next year into helping his party keep control of Congress, he's going to have to convince his party base, the most progressive members of his party, that they need to turn out for him, even if he hasn't accomplished all of the goals that he set out at the beginning of his administration. So the Democrats' biggest battle next year, their most important battle next year, isn't against Republicans. Their biggest battle is against the couch. And there are a lot of progressive voters deciding what's the use. That's one of the reasons you've heard Biden and many other leading Democrats begin talking with renewed vigor just over the last few weeks about the importance of voting rights policy. And that's an issue that had largely fallen off the screen in Washington, D.C., as they were concentrating on the president's climate change and social spending legislation. But Biden has made it very clear that he wants to come back to voting rights in early 2022. And Joe Manchin, of all people, has indicated that that's an issue on which he might be willing to work to move forward. So whether it's immigration, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's climate, most likely voting rights, Biden needs an issue. He needs a success to motivate his base. The great irony, of course, is that between the COVID relief package that was passed early in 2021 and the president's infrastructure package, which was passed early this fall, Joe Biden is responsible for more than $3 trillion in new government spending, which is the most expansive government spending package in history. But to a large degree, because Biden had allowed his supporters' expectations to become so much larger as a result of this reconciliation Build Back Better package, a lot of those loyal supporters are feeling somewhat disappointed right now. So in addition to finding a new win, whether it's on voting rights or something else, Biden's main job in order to maintain Democratic majorities in Congress is to convince Democratic loyalists, to convince to progressive voters that in fact that what he has been able to accomplish is more significant than he thinks. The equation is simple. If the Democratic base turns out in November, the Democrats keep Congress. If they don't, then Republicans win it. We'll see, of course, over the next 10 and a half months, whether Biden and the leading congressional Democrats are able to convince those progressives that they're worth their time and attention. We skipped completely over the polarization and partisanship topic. And that's one, because we've talked about plenty in 2021, we'll talk about quite a bit in 2022 as well. But before I bring in Jessica, I just want to touch on this for 1 minute because it's such an important issue. Matthew, my brilliant nephew, talked a little bit earlier about the Roman Republic turning into the Roman Empire, hopefully a little bit more catastrophic than what we're facing. But he also reminded us in the 20th century that we are able, that we have been able in the past to overcome these divisions. And Jessica, who I'll thank in person in a moment, brought a really interesting poll to my attention last week. And it was a poll of college students in America who were asked if they'd be willing to go on a date with someone from the other political party. And the majority of college students in our country said that they would not. They would not go on a date. Democrats would not go on a date with a Republican, and Republicans in somewhat smaller numbers would not go on a date with a Democrat. And it's really interesting to me because I've seen similar polling, not just with college students, but with voters of all ages in this country. And we've seen a remarkable trend. For most of US history, and for most of world history, most people, most human beings, would not want to marry someone of a different race, a different religion, or a different ethnic heritage. And while we still obviously have a very, very long way to go in terms of racial and ethnic and religious tolerance, poll numbers at least show that we've never been more tolerant as a people. More than at any other time in human history, large majorities of Americans and residents of other countries around the world would be willing to marry someone of a different racial or ethnic or religious background. So let's think about these polls for a minute. Let's match them up against each other. On one hand, we're more willing to engage in a relationship with someone who doesn't look like us than we ever were before in human history. At the same time, though, we're much less likely to engage in a social or romantic relationship with someone who doesn't agree with us on politics. So we are just as intolerant as our ancestors were when it comes to our socialization habits. We're just intolerant in a different direction. And so one last question, Claire, I'm going to ask you to put up before we bring Jessica on. I'm not going to ask about dating because, as I know, like me, most of our group that gathers each week is somewhat settled. So instead of asking about dating, I'll ask more broadly about socializing. When was the last time you socialized with someone from the other political party? If you're a Democrat, when was the last time you socialized with a Republican, or vice versa? Was it within the last week, within the last 7 days? Was it within the last month? Was it in the last year, within the last 12 months? Or has it been a year, more than a year, since you've last socialized with someone outside the workplace and not a family member? Has it been more than a year since you've socialized with someone from another political party? And Claire, how did we do on this one? How about that? 36%, more than a third of us, have socialized with someone from the other party within the last week, and roughly the same number have within the last month. Only 29%, 12% within the last year, and 17% in more than a year, less than 30% of us haven't socialized with someone from the other party for an extended period of time, which means our group, even if it has very strong political opinions, it looks like most of us are willing to look past political differences in order to enjoy a social relationship. So I find that very heartening. And the way I see it, Jessica, is if our group can do it, that means the rest of the country can do it too, right?
I think that would be the hope, but we will see. We will see what 2022 has in store for all of us.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Before we launch into Q&A session, just a reminder that now through December 31st is our end of year giving campaign, which helps us to end the year strong and continue hosting important programs like this in 2022 and beyond. I will put a link to where you can donate in the chat, and we appreciate any gifts you can make to support the council. You can also visit our website and donate there at lawacth.org. And also, this is kind of a bittersweet, I guess, end to the year as well, because this will be the last time that I'm doing the Q&A on our webinars, because I will be transitioning over into maternity leave early next year. And so my wonderful colleagues, Claire and Rachel, are going to be taking over on the webinars. I'll be here through January helping out, but just a huge thank you to our audience. Dan, it's been great doing all of these with you. And yeah, it'll be exciting to see. I have interesting things in store for 2022. I can say that.
You can say that again. Well, Jessica, I think I speak for our entire group that gathers each week that we loved working with you over the last many months, and we'll miss you terribly. But I don't think any of us would argue that the webinar is anywhere near as important as the new responsibilities you're about to take on. So we couldn't be happier for you and your husband, and we can't wait to see baby pictures.
Yes, for sure. And hopefully things will be less polarized and crazy for this little person coming into the world, and for all the little people that are out there that are being born in this pandemic, and that we can help to make this world a better place for them.
And those kids will be old enough to vote for Matthew Schnur for president in the year 2040.
This is true. They will be ready. All right, hopping into the questions. So during TV interviews, when senators say they think the Build Back Better bill is too expensive, they're rarely or ever asked what in the bill they don't support. Why is that?
Well, there's been a big division among the Democrats in Congress about not just whether to pare the bill back, but how to shrink it. And there are many Democrats who said, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, who said we should try to fund all these policy priorities, but let's just fund them for a couple years so that the budget balances. And then if they're popular at that point, we'll be able to convince people to continue funding these programs going forward. Other Democrats, particularly the more centrist Democrats, are saying, well, that really isn't fiscally responsible. And what we need to do is pick a smaller number of these priorities and concentrate on them. And so those Democrats who do want to narrow the package generally have been fairly forthcoming about what they would keep and what they would give up. And Manchin, whether you happen to be a supporter or a critic of him, he did present to the president this week his own version of the package, like I said, which did include expanded money for climate change, for universal pre-kindergarten, for expanded healthcare. And he very specifically did, among the big ticket items, leave out the children's tax credit. So you may agree with that, you may disagree with it, but he did lay out a fairly specific outline of what he believes should be in a somewhat smaller Build Back Better package.
Several people mentioned this in the Q&A. So they were asking about voters' rights, and many of them thought that that was the most pressing issue for 2022. Why do you think that the Democrats are so focused on the Build Back Better bill and not on voters' rights, which I think is much more important? And like I said, several other questioners submitted something similar.
Well, and it appears that somewhat belatedly, the president and congressional leadership are coming to the same conclusion. Even before Manchin's declaration on Sunday, regardless of whether you take it more seriously than I do or not, the White House and Pelosi and Schumer were already beginning to talk about a renewed effort on voting rights in 2022. And I think some of that is because it's an important issue in its own right. And a lot of Democrats argue that if the issue isn't addressed early in 2022, it could impede the Democrats' ability to fight to maintain their majorities in November of next year during the midterm elections. I think the other reason that they began to shift attention to it is because the president's Build Back Better reconciliation package, even before Manchin's declaration, was really struggling. In addition to Manchin, they still hadn't worked out whether immigration policy would be a part of it. They still hadn't come to an agreement on the state and local tax. So there were a lot of unfinished aspects of the Build Back Better bill. But I think there were also political considerations as well. And the president and Democratic congressional leadership also realized that, as I said a few minutes ago, if they're going to motivate the Democratic base to turn out in November, addressing voting rights is probably going to be a more motivating issue in that regard than a larger and somewhat more complicated social spending and climate change legislative package.
The World Health Organization is saying that Omicron will push Europe to the brink. Any reason why we should fare better than Europe?
Okay. Well, we don't know. And I think one of the biggest unknowns at this point is that even if it's clear that Omicron is much more contagious than the previous variants, we still don't have a sense of its severity. The early reports, the early analysis suggests that its impact on most people, at least those who've been vaccinated, isn't as severe. But what we don't know yet is whether it's because in South Africa and some of the other countries where Omicron took hold first, whether it's because it hit a younger population that generally tends to be able to resist these viruses to a greater degree. I think it is entirely reasonable to assume that what we're seeing in Europe will lead to a very difficult January, at least in the US. I would be very surprised if that wasn't the case. But the hope is that a contagious disease that isn't as damaging will pass through the communities, first in Europe and then in the US, much faster than the previous versions of coronavirus have.
How would you rate Governor DeSantis's war on COVID?
Well, there's two ways to measure the way the states have taken on COVID. One is on questions related to health. The other is on questions related to the economy. And if you compare and contrast California and Florida, which both governors and Newsom and DeSantis enjoy doing, it is clear that California has been able to avoid nearly as serious a health and an illness and a death impact as Florida. On the other hand, California has suffered to a much greater degree economically. DeSantis, in a somewhat misleading way, minimizes the health impact on his constituents. But he does argue that his approach has kept the state from being harmed as much economically. And he also points to other cultural factors, depression, isolation, drug and alcohol dependency, and so on. So he argues that his approach was much better economically in these other areas. Newsom has pointed out correctly all the way through that the health impact on California is much less than in Florida. Individuals and voters will decide for themselves which of those two criteria is more important. If you believe health is more important, then you're more inclined to see stricter measures as important. If you believe that reopening a society and reopening its economy are more important, then almost by definition, you want to see less restrictive measures. And as we know very well by now, the country is so deeply divided, not just red and blue, not just the Democrat and Republican, but on questions of vaccination and approach to COVID, that which of those two approaches, the DeSantis alternative in Florida or the Newsom alternative in California, is a matter of immense cultural and social and political division. So depends who you ask.
Several people were asking about President Trump's event on January 6th. I guess he's going to be doing a press conference. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, President Trump announced just in the last day or so that he'll be holding a news conference on January 6th on the one-year anniversary of the Capitol riots. There's no way to know in advance what he's going to say, but it is worth noting the language he's been using over the last several days when talking about January 6th. The formulation he now employs is Trump says that the real outrage was on November 3rd, and that January 6th was merely a reaction to that. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the message from his news conference on the one-year anniversary is something similar. But being Trump, there will be some type of unexpected twist to it. Two other quick points on this, Jessica, before we go on. Of greater substantive import than what Trump says on January 6th is the progress that the January 6th Commission in Congress continues to make. And although it's not getting nearly as much attention as one might expect, the January 6th committee is really racing against time, realizing that it's entirely possible that Republicans will regain congressional majorities in November. And if Republicans do regain congressional majorities, that the January 6th investigation in all likelihood will be shut down. So Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney and their committee are being forced to make decisions about how quickly to move, even if it means not going as deep into the investigation. But regardless of the outcome of the elections in November, Congress, of course, doesn't change until January of 2023. So one prediction I will make is that between now and New Year's Day 2023, you will see a very broad-based report come out of that January 6th committee on the events of that day. And the news that we've been reading over the last several days about how the Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, was communicating with others, other information that's come out, I suspect that when that committee does finalize its report, it'll be a blockbuster.
Thank you. I'm going to summarize this person's question quickly. So she caught COVID after getting the vaccinations, and she's doing well and had low symptoms. She also did a home test so that she could just try to make sure she didn't infect other people. And she asks, why can't the Biden administration spin a more positive message and let's have a new year without any fear and mandated vaccinations? So she took a lot of the right steps. Would that have been a better message from the Biden team to encourage that rather than take such a negative tone?
Well, I don't know that I'd agree with the questioner's categorization of the president's tone. He very carefully and strongly avoided calling for additional shutdowns. He did not call for vaccine mandates for the entire population, although he still believes they should take place for government employees and for employees of large businesses. But his address today was not a series of very stringent measures to be taken. It was greater access and availability to testing and to vaccines for those who wanted it. It was additional healthcare and National Guard resources to help staff hospitals. And so it really wasn't the same kind of message that we heard in early 2021 when we were heading into another shutdown. I think Biden was very wary about sounding overly optimistic, given the news conference he had last July when he essentially proclaimed that we had defeated COVID before the onset of the Delta variant. But I don't know that today's message was particularly downbeat. It certainly wasn't very restrictive. Like I said, if anything, Biden seemed to be counseling patience. And the one message that he did deliver, which I think the questioner would agree with, is reiterating yet again the importance of getting vaccinated so that if you do catch a breakthrough version of the variant, that the virus is as mild as possible.
Thank you. Right. Sorry, I've got a lot of questions coming in. So thank you for all of your well wishes too. I'm getting a lot of those as well. So thank you so much.
Good.
Yeah, that's just great. Aren't we still getting mixed messages from the NIH, CDC, and US Health and Human Services?
Yes. And this has been, I think, one of the great disappointments of this administration. I don't know whether you can blame the president personally for this, but for a president who ran for office based on a message of competency and understanding of government, I think it has been disappointing that the various health-related elements of the federal government have not been clearer on how we should proceed through these various challenges. Look, any large bureaucracy, whether under a Republican or Democratic president, is going to move slowly and cautiously. That's just the way bureaucracies work. But I think it has been disappointing. And along with just the overall continuation of the virus, my own opinion is that one of the reasons that Biden's poll numbers have taken a hit over the months is because the American people are not hearing as clear a message from their government on how to take on COVID as they were hoping for when they voted for a president of much greater experience than his predecessor.
Thank you. There's been some discussion about the phrase vaccination as opposed to shot, as in flu shot, which leads to the terms used since the start of the pandemic and how the terms selected and their use have affected our reaction and responses. Please comment.
I don't know that the language use here has had a significant impact. And the questioner may be right. There's plenty of smart people in the country who agree with them and not with me. But my own opinion is that the semantics here have not been nearly as important. And those who have most strongly resisted the vaccine, I think, would resist it regardless of what it was called. For those of you who didn't see it, President Trump it was at a public event just in the last day or so, in which he told the crowd that he had gotten his booster shot, and he was booed. Donald Trump was booed by his strongest supporters because he'd gone and gotten the booster, the vaccine. So I don't know that the word, which means that this polarization, even over COVID, is so far out of control that even Trump himself isn't able to rein it back in. So I don't know that the word choice would have changed a great deal. What I would say, as someone who used to do political communications for a living, is I'm not wild about the term booster, because the term booster, for what appears to be an extremely necessary third shot for most of us to get, the term booster implies something that's optional and perhaps helpful. And I think the sooner we shift to talking to someone who gets that third shot as someone who's fully vaccinated, the more likely we are to encourage people to go back in to get that next round.
Thank you. What's the significance of the fact that the Coal Miners Union has asked Joe Manchin to reconsider his position? And is it significant of the fact that he announced his decision on Fox?
I don't know how significant it is that he announced his decision on Fox. One of the challenges with the Coal Miners Union, with organized labor in general, is they've been an extremely valuable part of the Democratic base for decades and decades and decades. And one of the messages that Manchin has been delivering over the course of this debate over the president's Build Back Better legislation is that he believes that these coal miners who, as we shift from fossil fuels to alternative energies, that they need to be taken care of. And there have been plenty of times in the past when presidents and administrations of both parties, both Democratic and Republicans, have turned to workers, union workers, whether coal workers, whether factory workers, whether auto workers, and essentially committed to them to help with job retraining and replacement so that someone working in an industry like this wasn't just left hanging by a broader economic shift. And historically, we really haven't done a very good job of living up to those commitments. So I think one of the challenges for the president going forward, again, not just with coal workers, but with his union base generally, is making sure they understand that he does intend to maintain this commitment to them in a way that many of his predecessors simply haven't. Where this becomes even more of a challenge than on coal is on the question of solar panels. One of the biggest questions we face as a country is how quickly we can shift from fossil fuels to alternative energies like solar. The most cost-efficient and the most effective solar panels in the world are now made in China. Biden wants to produce those panels here in the US, both in order to build back US industry, but also to send a message to the Chinese about their human rights atrocities that we discussed in this webinar last week. But by attempting to build up the US solar industry, he's making our transition, he would be making our transition from fossil fuels to solar more slower and more expensive. So these challenges do get complicated. And for a president who is such a strong supporter of organized labor, even though he wants to move quickly, he also needs to move carefully, because this is his political base. And they elected him president, not just in the general election, but in the Democratic primary last year too.
Interesting. I'm also working with my colleagues because China has slated to build 150 nuclear reactors in the very near future. So we're going to try to do a program on that again. I probably won't be here, but I'm working with the team to host something on that, just to kind of get a sense of what that could look like if they go the nuclear route there.
Well, as you know, Jessica, we've talked many times in this webinar in the past, about Biden's emphasis on multilateralism and re-strengthening relationships with U.S. allies in Europe and on the Pacific Rim. And as China begins to look more aggressive militarily, whether in the Taiwan Straits or whether it's with increased nuclear capacity, I think Biden's own opinion is that this is not a challenge the United States can take on unilaterally, but that it needs a much wider and stronger lineup of allies in order to push back against China in a collective rather than an individual action.
Joe Manchin has indicated what he will or won't support. Do we have any idea what Kristen Sinema will support?
Okay. Sinema has been more circumspect, or I'd say that she's been quieter. She hasn't been as public in her declarations as Manchin has been. But all reports suggest is that while she and Manchin do not agree on every single issue in this legislative debate, and for example, she does want to spend more on climate-related measures than Manchin does. The general impression that have come from people close to her is that if Manchin were to sign off on a package, she and other centrist Democrats at that point would too. And it's worth noting that while Sinema and Manchin get the most attention, there's probably 4 or 5 other moderate Democrats. There's Mark Kelly in Arizona. There's Maggie Hassan and Gina Shaheen in New Hampshire. There's Mark Warner in Virginia, possibly John Tester in Montana, none of whom are really all that thrilled with this package either. And they've been very happy to let Manchin take the heat on their behalf. So when we say Biden's only 1 vote away from getting this, that might not be entirely true. But what is true is if Manchin does come around, my impression is he will not do so unless his fellow Democratic centrists are willing to vote for the bill also, Sinema included.
Thank you. A couple of people have asked why there has been so little progress on state prosecutions of President Trump.
Well, there has been progress, most notably in New York and in the state of Georgia. Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, and Cyrus Vance, the outgoing district attorney in New York City, are both moving on parallel legal tracks against Trump, to the point where Trump just yesterday and his lawyers announced that he was filing suit against James, which has historically been one of his favorite tactics when he begins to feel cornered legally. The state of Georgia is moving against him also. And while these cases are moving slow on a political clock, as it relates to the courts and the legal system, they're actually moving pretty quickly. So they're not being resolved nearly as quickly as many people would like. But by traditional legal standards and timelines, they're doing okay.
Why do you think Biden is not criticizing the Republicans in Congress for the inability to pass important legislation?
Well, Biden does criticize Republicans in Congress over this. He hasn't been as loud about it recently because I think he's just come to realize that regardless of what he says or how loud he says it, they're not going to move. And so for him, whether it's the social spending and climate change, whether it's voting reform or other issues, if he's going to get it, it's going to be with 50 Democrats. And because even a president only has a limited window of opportunity through which to communicate with the American people, beating up the Republicans, even if it's not going to have, especially if it's not going to have an impact, probably isn't as good a use of his time. I don't like to make predictions, as you know, Jessica, but a very, very safe prediction is if you don't think that Biden is being sufficiently vocal in criticizing Republicans for inaction now, wait until September or October. And as the midterms draws closer, I think that message will take center stage as opposed to the things that we're hearing him talk about more frequently right now.
Thank you so much. Well, we are at the end of the hour, and I just want to say again to our audience, thank you so much. Thank you for your support over these last, again, almost 2 years of hosting these programs with Dan. And Dan, I'm really happy we got to kind of end with like a family show this year, and it was wonderful to see your nephew, and thank you for bringing him on. So I hope the pizza is good. Hope you have a great time with your family, and to all of our audience, have a great time with your family this holiday season. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the future. Thank you.
Well, Jessica, like I said earlier, we are so, so happy for you and your husband. We can't wait to meet these kids next year, and we're going to be eager to welcome you back as soon as you're able. But thank you for all the wonderful work you've done, not just on this webinar, but for a whole array of World Affairs Council town hall programming over the years. We're grateful to you. We're going to miss you temporarily, and we can't wait until you're back.
Thank you so much, Dan. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. We can't wait for her to come back either, Dan. Dan, just wishing you a wonderful holiday with your family, and a big thank you to you for all of your time and expertise over, oh my gosh, we launched this in March of 2020, and I think we've tallied more than 90 politics in the time of coronavirus. So thank you so very much.
I think you know how much I enjoy it, and I'm grateful to you and to the whole team at the World Affairs Council. People see Jessica every week, but Claire and now Rachel, Marianne, the entire team you have there does incredible work. And I think you'd agree with me, Kim, that we owe special gratitude toward our incredible audience that's stuck with us through now 4 variants of COVID. And we're thrilled to have all of you. And at some point, we'll be excited to see you more frequently in person again. But in the meantime, we're very, very thankful to you for taking the time to spend with us, and hope all of you have a very happy holiday seasons as well.
Thank you. And as I mentioned, Dan will be back on Tuesday, January 4th at 5 o'clock. And he has a new title that I'm thrilled with. It will be called the Dan Schnur Political Report, which is so perfect.
It wasn't my idea, for the record.
Well, I think we may have suggested that to you, and you were kind enough to go along with it. But I think it's perfect. And Dan will present his live stream report monthly, the first Tuesday of every month. And the monthly webinar will take a deeper dive into American politics to produce even more compelling content than what we're able to do on these weekly series. And in addition, Dan has also so graciously agreed to moderate one in-person event for us each month. So please stay tuned. That will give you a great opportunity to connect with Dan both via the live stream as well as in person, which will be up close and personal. So mark your calendars for January 4th, 5 p.m. for the first Dan Schnur Political Report. And then on January 20th, just 2 other quick updates on upcoming programs. We have California Transportation Secretary David Kim, who will be discussing the funding benefits and distribution that California will be receiving as a result of the infrastructure bill. And on January 25th, we have an in-person breakfast downtown focusing on the global supply chain with a host of just brilliant panelists who will be sharing their expertise. Claire will be putting these up on our website, hopefully by the end of this week, if not early next week. So please check it out. Register today. Everybody, please stay safe and happy holidays. Thank you.
Thanks.